Guys, we are continuing on the theme of ARM and going a lot deeper now with Alexander talking about ARM templates and how to work together with PowerShell DSC.
Yeah.
Show's on.
Okay, thank you. So welcome to my ARM template and PowerShell DSC, a match made in heaven session. So what can I say about it but hell yeah, right? Very appropriate, I think, here. We'll talk about match made in heaven, but here in Helsinki, this is a good thing. So what we have today when we work with Azure, we have two different deployment models. We have a Azure Resource Manager model, and we have a classic one that is based on service management. So they work with the two different sets of API sets, and they are not quite compatible, right? Recommendation now is to move and deploy your resources using Resource Manager. If you have some classic ones, try to redeploy them and migrate them to Resource Manager, because you will get a lot of benefits with Resource Manager. So what were the problems with the classic model? The main one was that there is no way to group related resources that are part of the same solution or application together. So with classic deployment model, with service management deployment, if you work on a complex solution that included a lot of different services, once when you are done with that project, it was practically impossible for you to delete and remove from your subscription all the services that are part of that solution. So that's the problem that they tried to solve with Resource Manager. It was also very hard to have a good access control with your services, with the service management. So that's another problem that they tried to solve. And also, they didn't have a tags, so it was not possible for you to tag your resources so that you can monitor them together, create a logical grouping of things so that you can have a better insight into billing, for example. All those things were missing with service management. So the benefits of our model are, first, that now we can deploy and manage and monitor all our related resources together. And you will see that once when you start working at it, how easy it is now to have a good insight like what's happening with your solutions, because you have them all together in the same group. Another good thing here is that you can now repeatedly deploy and redeploy your solutions. We can apply RBAC, and Magnus already talked about that stuff, which is really important. Before, we had that problem that if you wanted to enable someone to work with your services, you needed to give them a co-admin rights on your subscription, which will be kind of similar to having a multiple domain admins on premises, and we all know that's the bad solution for a problem when we talk about permissions. Now with RBAC, we have a really good granular control, so we can assign those rules on a group, or we can assign those rules on the resources. We can also use tags to organize them in a logical way and go beyond those groups for that. The way how we deploy stuff with Resource Manager is we use templates. So even when you're working with the Azure portal, which is probably the first way how you interact with Azure resources that you have in your subscription, you are using templates. And you will see later during some demos that I will show you actually how you can get to those templates even when you are in Azure portal. So it's not that you will deal with them and work with them only if you think about coding and you think about some tooling for working with the templates. Templates are nothing more than JSON files, JavaScript object notation files. And they are becoming kind of a main way to work in a modern way with Azure resources. But because you will see what are the benefits when we start working with the templates. Just one question for you. How many IT pros I have in the room here? Not a single one. That's cool. One, okay. Yeah, I'm the second one, so okay. So a short section about terminology first. So every time when I mention resources, I'm talking actually about those manageable items that are part of your Azure. And the common ones are virtual machine or VNet, storage account, a database. So those are the resources or resource types as they call them as well. And then we have a resource group. Resource group is kind of a container that holds together related resources. And one of the main things, like how you think, how should you group things, you think about the same life cycle. So if your resources have the same life cycle, they are perfect candidates to be grouped in the same resource group. Very often when you see, today when you see solutions, you will see that people usually put all the resources together in the same resource group when they work on something. But later when you start creating something for production and you start creating a complex solutions, you will realize that it's better to separate those things maybe in a different resource group and deploy them separately and then link them later. Because if you think about it, if you have a virtual network in Azure, the life cycle of virtual network is not actually the same as a database. So you might share that virtual network with some other solutions, right? So it does make sense to put them in a separate resource group. Or if you have a database that you will share among different solutions, then it makes sense for you to put that database separately, right? Very often today still people put them all together, especially for examples, for those sample templates that we can find on the internet. Then we have a resource provider, which is actually a service that supplies a different resource types that we can deploy and manage through Resource Manager. And you need to be aware that not all regions have the same capabilities and same abilities. So you need actually to do some kind of a researching to see if you are working, for example, with West Europe, and there is some new service, is that service supported actually through a resource provider? Can you have access to those resources that you want to work with in that certain region group, or you need to wait a little or move to some other region, right? You need to kind of do some kind of research there. And then we have the Resource Manager templates that I mentioned already, which is just a textual file written in a JSON format, and we put all the resources that we want to deploy in that file. We will talk about it a little bit later. And I will focus now on that management layer, because there is a couple of different approaches to management. You can use different tools for it. It depends on like what is your knowledge already. How many of the things you already know, right? If you are familiar with PowerShell, then it makes sense for you, for example, to use Azure PowerShell to work with your resources, right? If you are a CLI guy and you want a cross-platform solution, a solution that works on a Linux and a Mac boxes, then you might think about Azure CLI. Some people start and stay with Azure Portal. They are just satisfied with it. They don't need really scalable solutions. They don't redeploy a lot. They don't work with a lot of different resources. That environment, they are changing a lot, and they are fine with the Azure Portal. You will hear later what's my approach and what I think about Azure Portal. Then we can interact with the REST APIs directly. It's a little bit lower level, but it's also there, and we have development tools supporting different SDKs and different programming languages for working with. And the best part here is when we think about those different management solutions, we can just switch between them very easily because they're all based on the same APIs, and they provide pretty much the similar experience somehow. So you can do some things in a portal and then switch to a PowerShell, or start with a PowerShell and then one day or next day you are sitting in front of the Linux box and you start working with Azure CLI and continue with your deployment where you were before, the day before, with a PowerShell, right? So it's possible to do that. So for me, the Azure Portal is a great learning tool. Why I'm saying great learning tool? Because it has all those help links and the tooltips. It's much easier to find about limitations, for example, for certain things when you need to fill out the forms there, because it's wizard driven, right? You have all those forms that you fill out, and if you work with a PowerShell, maybe you will get a cryptic error message when you try to create a storage account because you are not aware that you need to use all the lowercase and you cannot have more than 24 characters for a name, or maybe you are not aware that you have 12 characters limit for minimum length of a password. But in Portal, you will get a tooltip telling you, oh, you need to correct this thing, you made a mistake. So for learning, Azure PowerShell Portal is just awesome, right? But once when you're good with it, once when you know what you're doing, then it's time to move to something that it's more scalable, something that it's more flexible, gives you more options because it's just easier to put the code in a source control, right? The clicks and GUIs are not good for that. And documentation is also hard to provide when you need to do all the screenshots and stuff, so it makes sense to go to a command line or to go to a code. When you work with Portal, it's also possible to export templates. So usually the first experience for guys that never worked with templates before is through a Portal now, and we have a couple of options. So you can export the actual deployment, a template for actual deployment that you have, and for that you can go to deployment history option, or you can just during creation you have automation options button next to create button. Then if you click, you will see the underlying template that will be deployed once when you click on create button. So what's interesting for a lot of people is that they say, like, I don't want to work with the template. I don't care about code. I'm fine in a Portal, but they're not aware that actually what's happening behind the scenes is deployment of those templates. And there is also option to export the current state of your resource group. To do that, you will go to automation script option in settings session, but you need to realize that the generated templates are different. If you export the template that represents the current state of your resource group, you will get a template that will have a lot of hard-coded values in it, probably not as much parameters as you used during the creation. So that template is a little bit different than the one that you originally used. If you go to deployment history and you see that, for example, you initially created one resource and then you added later through a Portal or a script another resource, you will not have one deployment there. You will have two deployments. And the first deployment will contain information about your storage account. But the second one will contain information about virtual network if you added virtual network later. You will not get one template that contains both. So that's the difference between those two approaches. So if you go to deployment history, you get kind of a more, let's say, pure template that it's closer to initial one that you use. Exported one is actually a little bit different than that one that is used during the initial deployment. It's changed a little, and you need to probably do a little bit more of editing if you want to get to something that it's reusable, changing all the parameters and all that stuff. So be aware of those changes. And once when you have a template, even when you are still in a Portal, you can continue working on it. So there is an option there, I don't know how many of you used that before, to save a template to your library. So you can have your own library of templates inside of Azure Portal. You can even share those templates with other members of your organization. Or you can download template and then edit it locally with your favorite JSON editor. Usually that's Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. Right? Visual Studio is not a part of a tool set for IT pros. So they have a kind of a problem with Visual Studio. It's too big for them. It's too complicated for them. And Microsoft thought about the problem, and then they created Visual Studio Code as a free cross-platform lightweight editor that doesn't have that kind of a baggage of all the things that you can do with it, so you can customize it. You need to do some work with it to enable it actually to work with the templates. It's not that hard, but just be aware that once when you install it, it's not immediately able to work with ARM templates. You need some additional things, and we will talk about that. If you want to work inside of Azure Portal with custom deployment, you can just go to New option and type template deployment, and you will get a way to work with it, because even the Azure Portal has some ARM template editor there. Very often when Microsoft talks about templates and how to start working with them, they will tell you that maybe the easiest way to work with them is to start with the library of so-called quick start templates that are available on the portal, or not a portal, but as a part of Azure documentation and GitHub repository. So I have all those links, both links on my slide here for you. And that repository is full of templates created by community and Azure team as well. So the idea is here to look for a template that is close to solution that you are targeting, and then you will download that template and modify it a little to suit your needs, okay? So let me show you in a demo how can we perform some of those things in a portal. So here I am in Azure Portal. I will go very with simple things and just try to create a storage account. So if I pick here and I go and want to click a name, so here is what I'm saying, a great learning tool, right? You have all those information buttons, you have those tooltips that will tell you if you made a mistake, and that's very cool here. So if I start typing here this, and it will start checking and say like, okay, this is already taken. If you do those things by yourself and you don't test for availability, then during deployment you will actually get error, right? Here, Azure Portal is doing all that stuff for you. So this is pretty cool, right? You don't need to put a lot of effort there. So let me try to create this one, and that one will work. I will not change a lot of things here, just maybe this one, just to show you. And before I'm starting, let me say this RG, it will also try to validate and to check if it's available. You see here I have automation options. If I click automation options, even before I started creating it, I'm now switched to a blade with an ARM template. So I will not go into details right now. I just want to show you that it's available here. You can see what's going on. If you click on parameters, you can see here the values that are just filled out in that form. And you also get 4 different ways to deploy it. So you get a CLI script for it, you get a PowerShell script for it, very robust one. Also you need just the 2 commands in PowerShell to do it, but this is a script that it's created to be robust, to have all the error handling and all that stuff. You have a .NET class for it, you have a Ruby class for it, okay? So all those things are prepared for you already. You can download them and have all those files locally on your machine, so you can start working with your JSON editor locally. With the templates, you can add to a library or deploy. So once when I click create here, I will get a storage account. So usually it's created pretty fast. So I need to go to my resource group, and you can see here under deployments, then I have one deployment now in progress. So once when it's done, it will say that I have one deployment that succeeded. And once when I click on that link, I will be brought to a deployment history. And from there, I can see, so sometimes this refresh button works, sometimes it doesn't. Let me see if it works now. So it's still in progress. You can see here we have this icon telling me that it's still not done. But I think that sometimes it's kind of easier to just close all those things. See, one succeeded. If I click on it, now I have here a list of deployment. I only have one deployment of one resource. And I can go here to view template and see that actual template that was kind of similar to this one, but this one is actually deployed. Okay? And here I have the same options for download, add library, and stuff. So this is really cool. You can also go to a resource group that it's, let's go to one that it's a little bit more, okay, let's go to this one. And if I go to this one, you see that also succeeded. I have much more things here. And with view deployment, as I said, when I do a download here, I can get all the files that I work with. What happens if I add it to a library? If you add it to a library, what you get, and this is still in preview, you get this templates option here that will contain the library of the templates that you have. So I have here one, and if I click on it, see, first I get the edit button here, but it's kind of confusing. This edit button will not actually enable me to edit the actual template. I will get a chance to edit description for it. If I really want to edit it, I need to go to deploy. And first I will get a form with all the parameters and all that stuff, so I can reuse this template for a new deployment. But if I go here on the edit button, then I'm actually now in the editor that I can use to change something. Okay? And you see here that I have access to all the parameters here and variables, and we will talk about the structure of the ARM templates very shortly. So this is one of those experiences that we are still in the portal, but we can deal with ARM templates. We can export things and make our development and deployment of resources easier. So here is, in a nutshell, this is the simplest ARM template that you can have, right? So here, if you just look here, we have some of the properties. We have schema, content version, parameters, variables, resources, and outputs. Schema, content version, and resources are mandatory. You need to have them. They are required. You don't have to have variables. You don't have to provide any parameters, so you don't need to customize. But it doesn't make sense really not to have a customizable ARM template. Why? Because with parameters, you can use the same template, just providing different parameters, and you can redeploy it for different environments, for a test environment, or for a QA environment, or for production, right? And we have variables, and there is a kind of a tiny line between what you will put in a parameters section and what you will put in variables, right? Because sometimes some developers will think maybe this is good to be a parameter. I want to change it every time for every single deployment. And some guy will say, yeah, but I will not change the operating system every time, so maybe it's better to define that as a variable. Because idea to have a lot of different parameters is not the best idea, because if you have a lot of them, then you will need to think about all of them all the time. And that doesn't make sense every time, really, right? So it makes sense sometimes to put them just in the variables and have still control, because they will be in a separate section, kind of, and it's easier to spot the problem and put them in parameters if you want, right? So for me, it's kind of, sometimes when I look at some other people's solutions, and I see that they have like 20 variables but 2 parameters, I decide, yeah, but maybe I can have 4 parameters because I really want to change VM size every time when I deploy this thing instead of having it as a variable. The most important thing is to try to have as less as hard-coded values as possible. Why? Because it's hard to hunt for them when you want to change them. It's easier if they are just as a variables. and then you will reference variables inside of your code, right? So be careful about that. Tooling for ARM templates. So as the JSON file is actually a text file, you can use a notepad if you want. If you're a masochist, sure, no problem, right? But they have some better solution, but in my opinion, still not the best solution, because I think that no one should actually write ARM templates. They should be generated for us. They should create some kind of an abstraction layer on top of it, create a DSL for it, so that it's easier for us to write ARM templates, or even better for guys that are not that experienced, especially if they are not developers, they are coming from the IT part of the story, then some kind of a visual-like tool that will you just have some boxes with the properties, and then when you press OK button, the ARM template will be created for you. Makes sense, right? Because every time when I talk about ARM templates, especially to IT pro audience, they are kind of overwhelmed with code and with all that stuff. It's like I would like to have something simpler. But what we have now is practically two tools, right? We have Visual Studio and we have Visual Studio Code. For Visual Studio, you need to add Azure SDK, and that will enable you to write ARM templates. Then they will provide starter templates for you so that it's easier for you just to start writing them. And if you ask me, I think the Visual Studio is the only tool at the moment that gives you ability to write ARM templates from scratch. As you have seen so far, we try to work with something that is already deployed and then edit a few things here and there and maybe add some resources. But if you really want to start with a blank page, then the Visual Studio is the one. Visual Studio Code is, for me, more of a tool for editing something that exists or adding some simple things there. But the good thing about Visual Studio Code is that it's free and it's cross-platform. So if you are switching between Windows or Linux boxes, or you're working on a Linux box, you can still use it there. What you need to add to your Visual Studio Code, you need Azure Resource Manager extension. And you can edit it easily, Control-P, and then install Azure RM. Search, you will see that during the demo, and you will get a page for installing that extension. Once when you have that extension, another thing that it's really needed for you are ARM snippets. So on a GitHub, on a Microsoft repository, on an Azure repository, there is actually a JSON file that you can copy and then paste into user preferences in Visual Studio Code, and then you will get access to those snippets so that you don't need to write every single line of code. And let me show you how that works with Visual Studio first. So what I have here is Visual Studio Code. This is Visual Studio. This is Visual Studio Code. You can see pretty similar experience here. For installing that extension, what you need to do, Control-P, and then you will say X install Azure RM. You don't need to know the full name of that extension. Press Enter for a search. I have it already installed, so I get this information here. If not, I will be presented with the way to install it. This is practically the web page for that tool. So you can install it here or uninstall it and remove it if you don't want it. What we also want is snippets. So we can go to File, Preferences, User Settings. Not User Settings, but Preferences. Use snippets, and snippets for JSON. And then you will actually have this part that is commented, and then after that you will add your code from a GitHub repository. So how will that help you? If you start working on a new file and change a format for a new file to JSON, once when you say here ARM, you immediately get snippets for you. So I will use this skeleton one that will give me that simplest possible ARM template. Then I can go to resources. It looks like I have a bug here. I need to go twice. And if I type here ARM-VM, I get snippets for Linux, Ubuntu, and Windows VM. If I pick that, I get all this code. So I don't need to write from scratch all those stuff. I need to go here and define VM size and a VM name and all this stuff. So it's pretty cool, right? I'm not saying it's the best possible, but it's much better than if you need to start writing all those things by yourself, right? So once when you have extension and the snippets, you're good to go. You can start working with Visual Studio Code and ARM templates. So let's talk now a little bit about deployment. This is, up to now it was all like authoring things, and I would like to talk a little bit about deployment. First, in Azure Portal, you can deploy, as you have seen, we have those options there for a custom template deployment. And they also provide you Azure and PowerShell and Azure CLI script for it, and .NET and Ruby classes for it, so you don't need to write that. If you work with Visual Studio, you will see that later. Then when you create a project, you will get Azure PowerShell deployment script, and that script is actually the same as the one that you get in Azure Portal. Okay, so you can reuse that. You can use the REST API. You can use continuous integration with Windows Studio Team Services as well. And here as an example, I have a few lines of PowerShell code for deployment. So the first thing that you need to do, you need to create a resource group. So for that, we have new Azure RM resource group. How many of you are experienced with Azure PowerShell? Just a few. Okay. We will talk about it a little bit more when I will show you the difference between imperative PowerShell and ARM templates, how that works. We can compare that for working with the VMs. We also have this test Azure RM resource group deployment for testing validity of ARM template before we start the actual deployment. And then we have new Azure RM resource group deployment commandlet for working with deployments. There are so many different ways, and the one that you see on a screen is the one then I have a template locally on my machine, and I have a parameter file locally on my machine. But I will show you later with the show command how many different options we have, because we can have and fetch a template that it's on some online, on some GitHub repository, for example, and work with the local stuff as well. So you will see we have a lot of different options there. And now I will switch gear a little and talk about deployment of virtual machines, because the topic for today is how to kind of get the best of both worlds when we work with ARM templates, but we also can work with the DSC, which is Desired State Configuration, a thing to configure your VMs. Because with ARM templates, you get a way to deploy your Azure infrastructure using code, but then once when you have it, you need something to configure your VMs as well, right? Windows and the Linux boxes too, right? So we want to have a full solution that will give me a way to use code to define Azure infrastructure and also to configure VMs. Because for a lot of different Azure solutions, you have a VM as a part of a story, right? For creating a VM, we also have a number of options. We can use Azure Portal to create a VM. We can use imperative PowerShell or Azure CLI, or we can use ARM templates. So here you have the example, what are needed if you want to use Azure PowerShell for it. If not, still you need to create 5 different resources when you work with a VM. You need a storage account to store your VHDs with the operating system or a data disk. You need a virtual network. It's not optional. So when you work with Resource Manager compared to Service Management, you need to put your VMs in virtual network, okay? Then you need a public, maybe, but maybe not, but usually if you work, especially for the demos, and you work with a single standalone machines, you need a public IP address, you need the NIC, and you need the virtual machines. So those are the 5 resources that you will need to create with your PowerShell. And you will see later that even when we work with the ARM templates in Visual Studio and we use one of those starter templates for VM, we will get those 5 resources as well. So let me show you that difference and how that looks like. So locally here, I will not go through all this code. I will just show you those steps, and you will see how that's maybe long, maybe not, maybe complicated. I'm not sure, but this is just a part of a story, actually, because it can get complicated if I introduce error handling, if I introduce all the checking, like if I have a storage account, don't create a new one with the same name and all those things. It will get complicated. This is just like the simplest steps to go through our Azure PowerShell to create a VM and to also do some research using PowerShell to find out what are the proper values for VM size, what are the, do I have the storage account created or not? So all those things are available here, and you will see that even when you start working with templates, you will need to use imperative PowerShell sometimes because it will give you a way to find out what are the valid values for certain things. So instead of going to documentation for it and search what are the values that I need to specify for VM size, for example, you can use PowerShell, and PowerShell will tell you you need to use, for example, standard underscore D1 and not just standard D1 or something else, right? So PowerShell can help you even when you work with the templates. So let me show you this because I promised to show you the different deployment options for this. So those are all different parameter sets that you can have. As you can see, we have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like 8 or 9 different parameter sets for different ways of deployment, and they even try to name them properly so that even when you look at those names, you will see that what's possible, and that you need to use this one if you have a template in a public URI and parameters object, or you have the template file here and parameters URI, for example, so they use different parameters for that. And here it's kind of easier to find out what's possible. So you will need to install Azure PowerShell. You can do that going to Azure PowerShell GitHub repository, or you can fetch that from PowerShell Gallery. If you have package management module or the latest version of PowerShell. They just released the new version yesterday. So the current version of Azure PowerShell is 3.4. And they are releasing on a monthly basis. So almost every month you get the new version of Azure PowerShell. You need to authenticate to Azure. I will not do all that stuff. And then, as I said, first you need to create a resource group. So for that, we have a commandlet, a new Azure RM resource group. After that, you will create a storage account. So this code is actually part of one of my workshops that I'm delivered recently. So I'm just reusing that code because I use that to go through every single step and to explain the guys how can they work with the imperative PowerShell to do that stuff. And then we, after that, switch to ARM templates, and I show them how to do that with ARM templates. But it was easier for them to go through all these steps here first, and then they understood all the blocks of ARM templates later. It was kind of, it worked for them. So a storage account. Then after that, for example, it's interesting that we have tab completion for a SKU name, so that you can see that standard underscore RS for locally redundant storage. So it's good that in PowerShell directly you have support for that. You don't need to remember what are the values for it. Then we will create a virtual network, IP address and the network interface, and then virtual machine. For virtual machine, we need to do some research about valid values for a VM size, and then for publisher and offer and SKU, because they separated all those things. So you need to know, for example, that the publisher name is Microsoft Windows Server, and they offer a Windows Server, and that Windows Server can have a different SKUs for 2012 R2, for 2016, for Nano Server, and all those things. So PowerShell is here to help you to get all those values, because otherwise you will need to go to documentation, or you will need to go to our Azure portal and think to kind of get them there, but it's not that easy. And once when we have them, we have finally every all those blocks for creating a VM, and it needs like usually 7 minutes to create a working VM using all this. So this will be approached like, we have a little bit more lines here because I included all the research and discovery part of the things, because I wanted to show you, and you can get this code later, how to find out actually what are the values for certain things, because that's sometimes a blocker for people, because they see the example in the documentation and they say, okay, for this one use basic underscore A1. It's like, how do I know that? Where did they pick that value, right? It's not that easy, but thanks to a PowerShell, we can get it. So what would be experience if we go to a Visual Studio and we want to create a VM there? So I will go to File, New, Project. Create a new project here, and then I will get a number of templates that I can pick as a kind of a starter for my template. The one that I have here is Microsoft Virtual Machine. So you here get information about the version. You get some information about hard-coded values for default values for parameters or some variables. So for example, if I don't change anything, I will use West US region and deploy D1 VM size. If I'm not satisfied with that, I want West Europe, then I will need to modify my ARM template. So once when I click OK, the project is created and all the things that I need are created for me. So the things that I need here, I have a template for ARM template here for my virtual machine. I have also a template for parameters, and I have Azure PowerShell deployment script, the one that I also have in Azure Portal that I mentioned before. So the interesting thing here is this JSON outline that gives you kind of a nice look at your ARM template. So you can see that for this template, they used 5 resources, as I mentioned: storage account, virtual network, public IP address, NIC, and virtual machine. Okay? Then they have 21 variables. So instead of having a lot of parameters, they have only 4 parameters, for example. Admin username, admin password, DNS name for public IP address, and Windows OS version. Because they think that if you use this ARM template, depending on the different environments that you want to use, those are the 4 that you will probably customize the most. Okay? But if you think that some of the values that are now part of variables are suitable candidates for parameters, then you can turn them into parameters and then change the code a little. Because you can see here that with 21 variables, they put a lot of things there. And you can have here information about publisher and offer, and all those things are here, right? So in case that you need to change it, and you are not satisfied, for example, that it's a locally redundant storage, you want geo-redundant storage, then you will change this variable and you don't need to change code later, right? So it's quite visible, but you also think that's not something that I will change very frequently, so it's not a candidate for a parameter, okay? Make sense? So this is a code for working with a VM, and if you can see, we have like close to 500 lines of code. The good thing is here also, if you select a certain resource here, it's selected here in code as well, and you can immediately focus on it and work on it. So you see both approaches, one with imperative PowerShell code and one here with ARM templates. They will both produce pretty much the same result, right? If I specify the same values for parameters and variables. So now when we have a VM that it's created, there is a time to configure VM. And there are a couple of options there, and some of them are better than others, right? So idea is if you think again about the title of this talk, Azure template, ARM template and PowerShell DSC, a match made in heaven. You might think that if we can get all that in one step inside of ARM template, maybe that's the best thing, right? So here still, let me show you like what people usually do. They use Azure Portal to create a VM, then they use RDP to connect to that VM, and then they use some GUI tools to configure it, right? This is something that we see a lot. What's the problem with that approach? It's not scalable a lot at all, right? You need to do that for every single VM. You need to repeat all those steps. I'm pretty certain you will make mistakes, right? So if you want to create 2 or 3 identical VMs, what are the chances that you will do that without a single error for the first time when you try it? Almost zero, I think. I've never seen anyone doing that complex task without making mistakes. Then you have guys that are kind of familiar with the PowerShell, they are okay with the PowerShell. They will use then Azure Portal to create a VM, then RDP to machine, and then use PowerShell to configure it. You can, if you don't want to use RDP because that's not scalable, that's not a good thing to do. It's better if you use and manage your machines from the comfort of your own admin client machine. You can use PowerShell remoting to connect to your machine and then use again PowerShell to configure it. Or you can move to a modern way of configuring machines and use one of the configuration management systems. So you can use desired state configuration or a Chef or a Puppet, depends if you have that already. Chef and Puppet used to be very popular in a Linux environment. Now they are also having momentum with the Windows as well, especially because they're working together with DSC. And we will talk about DSC very shortly. Then we can use something new that Microsoft created called Azure DSC extension that gives you a way to remotely pass the configuration to your VM and configure it to a state that you want. Or you can use ARM template together with Azure DSC extension, which can be kind of an ultimate goal for this presentation as well. Or Azure Automation DSC, which is a new service, also very powerful, and I will not talk about it, but keep that in mind also as one of the solutions when you can put the ARM template in that service and create kind of a vanilla VM without any configuration, but then you will assign configuration that it's part of that service, and machine will ask for the configuration and get it from it. So that works as well. So we have like a 2 bolded solution here on a slide that are, in my opinion, the best approach to configure a VM. So I mentioned DSC here, configuration management platform. So what is PowerShell DSC? It's a new configuration management platform. Why is it platform? Because it doesn't go against Chef or Puppet. They can reuse it as well. So it works also with them. And it enables deployment of configuration data. It can also be set up in a way that can fix potential drift. So if you have a website and you have an images folder and some junior admin by mistake deletes all the folder, then the DSC agent on that machine will be aware of that change and switch back to a state that you wanted and return the folder and all the images in it. To work with Azure and DSC, I would like to introduce a concept of VM agents and VM extensions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a VM agent, which is just amazing, and those extensions are fantastic for making it easier for us to do the management of our VMs. They are installed by default. There is a way for you to disable it and not install it, but I really don't recommend that because you will get a lot of benefits if you have VM agent on your machine. It's a lightweight process. It doesn't consume a lot of CPU or anything. And all those VM extensions are just software components that can extend the VM functionality and make that management easier. So the best way still to get the list of available extensions with a service management based commandlet, which is kind of strange. If you go with a resource manager commandlet, it's much harder to get the list. Microsoft promised to work and create a better user experience for us, and we are still waiting after a year and a half for it, but it can happen. I have hope. So we have here a number of extensions on a slide, like an access agent for restarting a password for admin. We have a custom script extension that allows to run a random PowerShell script on it, DSC extension, Chef client, Docker extensions, all those. We are focusing on DSC extensions. For the goal with the DSC extension is to upload and apply PowerShell DSC configuration to Azure VM that it's enabled with a VM agent and PowerShell DS extension. Here is very important to work every time with the latest version. So the latest is 2.21. It's released in December. The main change is support for nano server. And why I'm saying the latest is always the best, because not just because of the bug fixes, but they are adding new features to it. And you will probably use some snippets of code for ARM templates, and they will use their versions that are not the latest. So always check for the latest version and modify the template for it. It supports a number of different operating systems, and the link that you have here, and you will get it later, with a slide deck is one that you should have always available, because it has a release notes. So every single new version is documented in that link. It doesn't matter that it's created initially in 2014. Okay. So the steps for working with the commandlets and the DSC extensions is we need first to publish our configuration. So we will have a configuration, and then during the publishing process, the zip file will be created with that configuration and all the needed resources for configuring something if they are not built in, and then it will be uploaded to a Azure storage account. Interesting thing and then we will use set commandlet to configure actually our VM. The interesting thing is to notice the difference between service management and resource manager. For service management, we can use it with a machine that it's new or existing one. With ARM, we need to apply it to existing machine. So once when you start working with the ARM template, you will have that depends on saying first you need to have a VM, and then you can have extension for it. So let me show you a DSC extension demo. So here, as I said, it's important to see the available extensions and to check the version. So what I want to show you here, I piped the result of that list to outgrid you, which is kind of an Excel-like thing that will give me an easier way to get to the things that I want. And then I can look here and see the versions and think about the one that the publisher is just Microsoft PowerShell, because some of those that in one for Linux. The others are testing extensions that Microsoft needs to use before they move to a new version and stuff. So the version that it's current is 2.21. There is a number of commandlets for working with the DSC extension from a PowerShell. And the configuration that I want to apply to my VM is really simple. It will just create a folder in a root of the C drive. Nothing more, nothing less. It's just that simple example. So this is the configuration that will be converted into a zip file. If I need some additional DSC resources, they will add it as well. And then it will be uploaded to Azure storage account. If I don't change anything, then that storage account will have a new container called Windows-PowerShell-DSC, and it will be set to private. If you want to share that configuration for some other deployments, then you need to change the access policy to blob, and then you will allow anonymous read access to your configuration, which I did here because I will reuse this same configuration to use it in my ARM template. So I will use the same for PowerShell and ARM template. So once when you do the publishing, and for publishing you need to specify a resource group, storage account, a path to your configuration, and with this force I'm not prompted for anything. So I can actually run this. It will not destroy anything. because I specify verbose, I get all those verbose messages, but the one that it's important and then you need to remember when you work with these things is actually this URI to your zip file with your configuration script, because you will need that later. And then I need to set that, and for that you will point to your storage account, to container, to a name of your script. Your script can contain multiple configurations, so you need to give configuration name. In this case, I have only one, but still I need to give it a name. And then that one will be applied to my machine. So when I have this I can actually do it here and try to apply it. So after that, what I can do is I can connect, and the machine that I'm using for this example is a Nano server that I created initially with the ARM template, but that ARM template didn't contain a DSC extension part in it. So I'm kind of using a Nano that it's created with the ARM template, but without any configuration. And while we are waiting for it, let me show you how that same experience works here in Visual Studio. So in Visual Studio, what I need is a recent project. It's this one. So this is the same. This is a template that I use to add a DSC extension to just a simple Nano machine. And I got that script from a Nano server blog. So if you want to try those things, I really encourage you to go to and just search for Nano server team blog. They have all the helper scripts and all the things that you need to deploy a Nano server in a good way using certificates for later secure PowerShell remoting connection to it. If you want to add a resource, you will say add resource. You will go here through list. The one of the resources is PowerShell DSC extension. You will give some name. And then when you say add, it will add the code to it. So what I have here is I already added the code. What I needed to change here, I needed to change a version to 2.21 because I'm working with Nano server, and that version only works with Nano server. All the older ones are not. And then I need in configuration part to provide a URL to that configuration zip file. Okay? If you remember, I created that one with the PowerShell, so I remember that one, but that zip file can be on any publicly available or even privately available. If you put it, for example, on a private container in a blob storage, you will need to use SAS token for it. So it doesn't have to be private. To make it simpler, I use a private here. And there is nothing really secretive there. And then I said, okay, this is the script that you will use inside of that zip file. This is the name of that function. And after deployment, and I will just show you how logs are looking. Here I have, I needed like 9 minutes for the whole deployment. That template will go through all the stages of creating all those resources, and once when it has a virtual machine, it will go and try to here deploy a DSC extension. And once when the DSC extension is done, you have the fully configured machine with your proper configuration. In this case, it's just a folder on a root of a C drive, nothing more. So in the meantime, the PowerShell part of the story has finished. So let me just connect to that Nano machine just to show you that I'm not lying. It worked. If I didn't mistype a password, I should have now open a PowerShell session to my Nano Azure VM. As you can see, I'm doing that using HTTPS, so it's a secure connection. I'm using a certificate, and also I downloaded the certificate to my machine, so it's trusted. Enter PS session, I go here, and then if I do there, you can see that I have DSC demo folder, thanks to all that stuff. There is also get DSC configuration status commandlet. Then when you pipe it to a full list in a star, you get actually the output that it's there to give you more details about the resource that you actually apply to your machine. And your experience with the Nano server in the ARM template is actually the same as this one. And if you did the same steps, we will get the same result there. So just briefly, try to use declarative syntax and use ARM templates rather than imperative commands. Try to use deployment and configuration in ARM templates, but use imperative PowerShell for managing resources, for stopping or starting a VM or application, for discovering things that are available to you. So thanks to sponsors for all this, and thank you for attention.
All right. Before we break for coffee, any questions? Everybody wants some coffee?
Yeah.
Well, wait for the panel for the questions. So let's break for coffee and we'll be back in 30 minutes.